There are two kinds of people who get lost in Zion: the fools and the unlucky. The fools leave the trail, underestimate the heat, and mistake a topo map for a theme park guide. You find them dehydrated, sunburned, and embarrassed, but you almost always find them. The unlucky, they just walk around a bend in the canyon and the world swallows them whole. A flash flood, a rockfall, a single misstep on a 1,000-foot exposure. Nature doesn't have a hidden agenda. Its brutality is honest, and I learned to respect that. This was different. The Garson family wasn't foolish, and they weren't unlucky. They were gone. For 3 days, I'd been working my way up the network of unnamed tributaries that fed into the North Fork, pushing deeper into the backcountry than their filed hiking plan suggested. The main search grid had turned up nothing. No tracks, no signal, no trail of dropped gear. It was as if they had simply been edited out of existence. I was operating on a hunch, a sour feeling in my gut that the land itself was holding a secret. Every rockfall, every dried wash, every lightning-scarred juniper was a landmark to me, part of a personal map I carried in my head, my own atlas of scars. This search was carving a new, unsettling path across it. I found their camp in a small box canyon, tucked into an alcove of Navajo sandstone. The first thing that hit me was the quiet. Not the natural quiet of the deep wilderness, but a dead, insulated stillness. No birdsong, no buzz of insects, no skittering lizards. I unslung my pack, my hand resting on the grip of the radio, and walked toward the tent. It was a 4-person dome tent, perfectly pitched. The guy lines were taut and angled with a precision I'd only ever seen in an infantry field manual. I ran a hand along the rainfly. Not a gram of the ubiquitous red dust coated it. The main flap was zipped completely shut, the slider resting at the bottom. Nobody could have closed it from the inside. I pulled the tab. The zipper slid open with a sound like tearing fabric, though the teeth were undamaged. Inside, 4 sleeping bags were not just zipped up. They were cinched tight in their compression sacks, rolled with an impossible uniformity, and stacked like cordwood. Beside the tent, a fire ring of stones held a perfect pyramid of kindling and split wood, ready for a match that was never struck. 4 enamel plates were stacked next to it, gleaming as if they'd just been taken from a box. The cutlery resting on top was arranged in a perfect parallel spread. I picked up a fork. It felt weightless and utterly clean. There were no water spots, no residue, no sign it had ever been used to convey food to a human mouth. A few feet away, leaning against a flat-faced boulder, were their hiking packs, all straps buckled, all pockets zipped. Beside the tent flap, 4 pairs of hiking boots, 2 adult, 2 for children, were lined up in descending order of size. Their soles were wiped clean, the laces tied in neat, identical bows. The scene wasn't one of a family that had fled in terror. It was a place prepared for a departure that never happened, by people who had tidied themselves into oblivion. It felt sickeningly familiar. Back in Afghanistan, my job was to stand between the soldiers on the ground and the firepower overhead, to call in airstrikes when things went bad. I once watched a compound for weeks, trusting the clean data from a drone feed. I called in the strike. Only after the dust settled did we learn the gathering of hostiles was a wedding. My superiors, thousands of miles away, called it a good kill based on sanitized intel. This felt like that. It was the same procedural cleanliness, the kind that scrubs a human tragedy down to a list of inert objects for an after-action report. Pinned beneath a small rock, as if to save it from a wind that wasn't blowing, was a child's drawing on a sheet of folded paper. It was a stick-figure family, too tall and too small, holding hands beneath a round yellow sun. But something had been done to it. The waxy crayon lines, which should have been clumsy and uneven, were rendered with the flawless precision of a technical diagram. The sun was not a shaky orb. It was a perfect, mathematically pure circle. The smiles on their faces were composed of identical, unblemished arcs. An act of love and chaos had been tidied up, corrected by a mind that saw the mess, but not the meaning. I left the drawing where it lay. I couldn't touch it again. I had to move, had to push past the site. The narrow canyon continued for another 50 yards before ending in a sheer rock wall, slick with seeping groundwater. The air in front of the wall was distorted, shimmering in a way that had nothing to do with heat. It was a vertical disturbance, a 5-foot tear in the world that bent the light passing through it. For a half second, the sandstone behind it vanished, and I saw a sky the color of bone, illuminated by 2 suns, one a brilliant white point of light, the other a dull, angry crimson. I did what I was trained to do. I observed. I assessed. I raised my trekking pole, its tungsten carbide tip something real and solid. I extended it slowly until it touched the shimmering air. There was no sound, no spark, no sensation of impact transmitted up the pole's shaft. The final 3 inches of metal and carbide simply ceased to exist. I pulled it back. The end was perfectly sheared, smooth, flat plane where the tip should have been. I backed away slowly, my feet sure on the uneven ground, my mind a blank slate of pure animal instinct. I walked until the dead quiet of the campsite gave way to the whisper of wind in the upper canyon. I unclipped the radio from my pack, raised the antenna, and thumbed the transmitter. My voice, when it came out, was the same flat tone I'd used to report a fallen tree on a park trail. "Zion Dispatch, this is Ranger Rylance." A burst of static. "Go for dispatch, Mark. You find anything?" I looked back down the tributary, toward the place where the world had a hole in it. "I've found the Garson's location," I said. "There are no casualties. But there's a problem. A significant one." "What kind of problem?" "The kind you don't have a protocol for," I said. "You need to clear this entire sector, and you need to call Nellis." The answer from Nellis wasn't a radio call. It was 2 unmarked Black Hawk helicopters, their blades beating the quiet canyon air into submission. They landed in the emergency lot behind the visitor center with a storm of dust and rotor wash that sent tourist maps skittering across the asphalt. Men in desert fatigues, rifles held at a low ready, disembarked before the skids were even fully down. I was met by a young Air Force captain with a jaw so tight I thought it might crack. He didn't introduce himself. He just said, "You're with us, Rylance," and gestured toward the main building. The Zion Canyon Visitor Center was gone. In its place was a forward operating base, where the bronze relief map of the park once stood, a bank of portable servers whirred, thick black cables snaking across the floor to power stations. Soldiers patrolled the perimeter, their impassive faces a jarring sight against the backdrop of the Watchman Peak. My sanctuary had become a theater of operations. I was escorted into what used to be the main auditorium, now a command post. A massive digital map of the park was projected onto the screen where a film about Zion's delicate ecosystem usually played. A man in a flight suit, older than the others, turned from the map as I entered. He had Colonel's eagles on his collar and an air of unearned certainty that I recognized instantly. This was the kind of man who trusted a drone feed more than the man on the ground. "Colonel Roth," he said, not offering a hand. "You're Rylance. Give me your report." I walked him through it, starting with the dead quiet of the canyon. I described the campsite, the tidiness, the rolled sleeping bags inside the tent zipped from the outside, the clean shoes, the unburnt firewood. I focused on the child's drawing. "The lines were perfect," I said, as if a machine corrected them. "That's the part that matters. The psychology is wrong." Roth waved a dismissive hand. "The psychology is irrelevant, it's anecdotal." He pointed a laser at a section of the digital map, a red dot glowing over the tributary I had just left. A thermal overlay showed a cold spot, a deep blue void where the portal was. "This is what matters. We have a localized energy sink of unknown origin and a Class 4 containment breach. The family, their gear, it's all just collateral phenomena. What are the physical approaches to the event boundary? The phrase, collateral phenomena, landed like a punch to the gut. It was the same bloodless jargon they used in the debriefings in Afghanistan. The detached language that turned a village into a grid coordinate and a wedding party into an acceptable loss. My own voice turned flat, my old radio operator cadence returning. "You can't land a bird there," I said, my eyes on the map. "That washboard ridge, you can get a man in on foot from the north, if he doesn't mind a 600-foot scree slide. The canyon floor is the only direct route." "A team of specialists is already on site securing the campsite," Roth said, turning back to his screen. "Their preliminary sweeps show no organic residue, no DNA, nothing. It's clean." He gestured to a corner of the room where two men were checking equipment. They were dressed head to toe in white coveralls, the kind I'd seen biocontainment crews wear. They looked like ghosts haunting a laboratory, and they were getting ready to walk through my canyon. They think they can bag and tag God if they bring enough Ziplocs. "We need a guide," Roth continued, his back to me. "Someone who can navigate that labyrinth without instrumentation. All our systems are failing within a 2-mile radius. You've become a mission-critical asset, Rylance. Our subject matter expert." I saw it then, scrawled on a whiteboard behind one of the server racks next to a list of sensor frequencies. The mission name: Operation Blind Sentry. The irony was so perfect it wasn't even funny. These men, with all their technology and their absolute faith in data, were marching into something they couldn't see, led by a man they refused to listen to. "It's a matter of national security," Roth added, as if that explained everything. "Right," I said. "It always is when you don't want to fill out the paperwork." Roth turned slowly, his eyes narrowing. He looked at me not as an asset, but as a problem to be managed. "You're a former Air Force ground controller, Rylance. You understand the chain of command. You will guide my team to the objective. You will provide topographical and environmental expertise, and you will follow my orders. Is that clear?" He was giving me an order. The ranger in me wanted to tell him to take his operation and get the hell out of my park. But the operator in me, the part I had tried to bury for a decade, knew a different truth. They weren't asking. They had closed the park, occupied the ground, and now they owned me. I was back under a command structure where my judgment was a liability, and I was just a tool to get them to the door. My deepest fear realized. All I had done was trade one cage for another. "Clear," I said. The word sat bitter in my mouth like the first swallow of burnt coffee at dawn. The mission started just after dawn. My team was a 5-man package of mismatched parts. 2 technicians in their white coveralls, looking absurdly out of place against the red rock, were laden with sensor wands and sample cases. They moved with the careful, shuffling gait of men who spent their lives in clean rooms. Their escort was a 3-man fire team of Air Force security, led by a staff sergeant named Riggs who wore his authority like a fresh press on his uniform. He was all sharp angles and quiet confidence, but his eyes kept scanning the cliffs, looking for threats his training had prepared him for, and finding none. I was the compass, the human instrumentation. Roth had given the order from the comfort of his command post. "Proceed to the event boundary. Observe. Report. Do not engage." Engage what? The air? The silence? We followed the tributary, the water ankle-deep and cold. For the first mile, the world was normal. The canyon wrens called from the rockfall, and the sun gave the landscape depth and character. The soldiers walked with the easy rhythm of men certain of their gear and their place in the food chain. Riggs's radio man kept up a running stream of chatter with the fob, his voice a low murmur of acronyms and confirmations. Then we crossed the line. There was no marker, no visible change, but the world tilted on its axis. The first thing to go was the sound. The calls of the wrens vanished mid-trill. The whisper of the wind scouring the upper cliffs simply stopped. All that remained was the sound of our own movement, our splashing boots and the clink of our gear suddenly obscene in the profound stillness. The radio man, a kid named O'Connell, stopped. He tapped his headset. FOB Sentry, this is S1. Radio check over. Nothing. He tried again. Sentry, do you copy? He pulled the headset off and looked at Riggs, his face pale. Dead. Not even static. Riggs pulled out his GPS. The screen displayed a scrambled mess of pixels. No signal, he said, his voice tight. He pulled a standard lensatic compass from his belt pouch. The needle spun lazily, unmoored from magnetic north before settling on a random point somewhere behind us. He looked at me, and his professional certainty seemed to have a hairline crack in it. Your turn, Rylance. A grim sense of satisfaction settled in me. Their million-dollar systems were useless. Now they had to rely on the things they couldn't quantify. The angle of the sun, the texture of the rock, the map I carried in my head. We pushed on, and the wrongness deepened. I felt it first through the soles of my boots, a deep grinding that emanated from the bedrock itself. It was the feeling of immense weight being dragged, the sound a mountain might make if it were being forced to kneel. O'Connell started chewing on his lip, a nervous tick. The other soldier kept his hand on the grip of his rifle, as if he could shoot the feeling out of the air. "What is that?" one of the technicians asked, his voice thin through his suit's comms. He was holding up a sensor, its display a frantic crawl of meaningless symbols. "That's the reason we're here," I said. We were walking along a gravel bar when I held up a hand to halt them. I knelt by the water's edge. "Look here." Riggs and the technicians gathered around. In a shallow eddy, nestled among the jagged, irregular river stones, was a cluster of rocks unlike any others. There were a dozen of them, ranging from the size of a marble to the size of my fist. They were all perfect spheres, not worn round by the current, but shaped with a geometric flawlessness that nature could never produce. They were the same ruddy sandstone as the cliffs around us, but they had been reformed. One of the technicians, a man named Davison, knelt carefully and extended a hand. He picked up one of the smaller spheres. "The molecular density is off the charts," he murmured, his eyes fixed on the readout inside his helmet. "It's solid, as if every grain of sand was compressed into its most stable possible state." He tried to place it in a sample bag, but his movements were clumsy. He fumbled, and the stone ball dropped onto a larger rock. It didn't crack or chip. It made a strange, dead thud, like stone dropped on bone, and left a small, concave depression in the rock it struck. The men stared at the object. This wasn't a sensor glitch or a trick of the light. This was a physical violation of the rules. The world here was being edited, rewritten by an intelligence that valued perfect order over the chaotic, beautiful mess of reality. I stood up and looked ahead, deeper into the canyon. The air was beginning to shimmer. We had passed through the fringe. Now we were walking into the veil. Beyond the eddy of spherical stones, the air began to move. It wasn't a wind, it was a slow, oily shimmer that clung to the canyon walls, making the solid sandstone flow like fabric in a current. Straight lines bent. The sheer, vertical cliffs curved inward, as if the sky were a lid being pressed down on us. My internal atlas, the one built from years of walking these canyons, fought a losing war with what my eyes were seeing. I knew the path was straight, but every step felt like I was walking along the inside of a warped bottle. Riggs was close behind me, his rifle held tight against his chest, his head on a constant swivel as he tried to reconcile the terrain with his training. It was useless. There were no ambush points here. The ambush was the ground itself. Davison, the technician who had picked up the stone, stopped to adjust a sensor on his pack. He reached back with a hand to flick a switch. The click of the plastic switch sounded, followed by the scrape of his glove on the pack's fabric. Then it happened again. Click. Scrape. He was frozen in a 2-second loop, his arm jerking back, his head twitching with the motion over and over, a human stutter in the flow of time. "What's he doing?" O'Connell whispered. Davison's eyes were wide behind his faceplate, fixed on me, pleading. A low keen of terror began to escape his throat, a sound that was also caught in the loop, restarting with every cycle. "Davison!" Riggs barked, taking a step toward him. I put an arm out, stopping him. "Don't touch him!" I didn't know why, but it was an instinct. You don't touch malfunctioning machinery until you understand the current. Click, scrape, keen. The repetition was maddening, a broken record of a man's terror. After a minute, the loop shattered. Davison fell to his knees. He scrambled away from his pack as if it were on fire, his breath coming in hysterical sobs. The mission's discipline had broken, replaced by raw panic. While Riggs and the other soldier moved to calm Davison, O'Connell stumbled toward a placid pool of water trapped in a basin of rock. He needed to splash his face to find a single, simple sensation that made sense. He knelt at the edge, his hands cupped. He looked down. His reflection looked back up, and through it he saw something else. He didn't scream for long. It was a single, high, piercing note that was cut off as if by a knife. I turned to see him still kneeling, perfectly motionless. His hands were submerged in the water, his head tilted slightly, his eyes wide and fixed on a point somewhere beyond the rock, beyond the sky. They were the eyes of a man who had been shown the scale of the universe and been found wanting. All the fight, all the fear was gone. There was nothing left behind the stare but a terrible, placid emptiness. He had looked into the water and seen the glimpse. He was a casualty, as surely as if he'd taken a round to the chest. That was it. The mission was over. All of Roth's talk of containment and analysis was a joke. You can't analyze an earthquake while it's shaking your house to pieces. "Riggs," I said. My voice was calm, the voice of the operator taking over. "Get Davison on his feet. You and your other man are taking them both back to the fringe." Riggs looked from the catatonic O'Connell to the sobbing Davison, then back to me. The command structure he lived by was gone, replaced by the simple, brutal logic of the situation. He was a sergeant, but I was the only one left standing who wasn't broken. "What about you?" he asked. "My orders are to escort you." "Your orders are now to get your men out of here alive," I said, my eyes fixed on the shimmering air farther up the canyon. The grinding in the rock beneath my feet was stronger here, a slow, inexorable turning of unseen gears. This thing had violated my home, scarred my atlas, and broken these men for the crime of looking too close. I had to see its face. I had to know what kind of wound this was. "Go," I said. Riggs hesitated for a second, then gave a sharp, definitive nod. He hauled Davison to his feet and, with the other soldier carrying the unresisting O'Connell, began the slow, stumbling retreat back the way we came. I moved on alone. The only noise was my own breathing and the steady, deep-seated grinding of the bedrock. The shimmering in the air was thicker now, a curtain of warped light that I had to push through. The canyon ahead was a distorted parody of itself. A stand of ancient junipers appeared to melt and reform with every step I took. The ground beneath my boots became unreliable. A patch of solid-looking rock would give way like soft sand, while a patch of loose gravel would feel as firm as concrete. Gravity was a suggestion, not a law. My compulsion to see the source was an illogical animal need. It wasn't about the mission anymore or Roth's orders. It was about standing on the edge of the wound that had been cut into my world. I had to know what had made it. I rounded a final bend, and the grinding sensation stopped. So did everything else. I was at the epicenter. The air here was thin and carried a charge, the clean, metallic smell of ozone mixed with something else, the absolute neutrality of a vacuum. And there it was. Not a swirling vortex of energy, not a shimmering gateway, but a perfect absence. A vertical 5-foot-long slash hung in the air, 20 feet from the back wall of the canyon. It didn't reflect light or emit it. It consumed it. It was a patch of pure, unadulterated nothing, a rip in the fabric of the world. This was the portal. I took a step closer, and it focused on me. The world didn't vanish. It was overwritten. The glimpse wasn't a vision. It was a sensory onslaught, a forced download of a reality my mind was not structured to contain. The canyon was gone. I was standing on a smooth grey-black plain that stretched to a horizon of sharp geometric structures. Towers of interlocking skeletal struts rose at angles that no engineer would have chosen, their surfaces a complex filigree enclosing nothing but empty space. There was no soil, no dust, no sign of erosion or decay. Above me, the two suns burned in a silent sky. One was a white dwarf, a brilliant cold pinprick that cast hard black shadows with no soft edges. On the other side of the sky, a bloated red giant bled a wash of deep crimson light across the silent city. There was no day, no night, only the stark competing glare of a star at its birth and a star at its death. Then came the feeling. I felt the distinct and separate gravitational pull of every object in the solar system as a unique pressure on my body. The insistent tug of Jupiter, the distant caress of Neptune, the dense, heavy pull of the sun itself. My own body felt like a bag of loose parts, each one wanting to fly off in a different direction. Finally, the sound, or the absence of it. The great silence. The most terrifying part of the experience. No wind, no water, no life. The only thing to hear was a single, constant, low-frequency hum. It wasn't a sound wave traveling through air, but a direct vibration in my consciousness. And in the hum, I felt their focus turn to me. There were no eyes, no faces, but I could perceive their awareness in the way the interlocking struts of the nearest tower infinitesimally rearranged themselves, their patterns shifting with inquisitive logic. They weren't a species living in this place, they were this place. The thought, the architecture, the hum. It was all one vast, distributed consciousness. My mind, scrambling for a human word to contain a non-human function, landed on the only one that fit. Wardens. And in that hum, I understood their purpose. It flowed into me not as words, but as pure concept. They weren't malevolent. They weren't invaders. They were an immune system. Our universe, with its mess of random biological impulses, its raw emotion, its untidy physics, was a contamination. The portal was a breach, a wound in their reality, and we were the infection seeping through. The Garson family hadn't been murdered. They had been quarantined, excised from the timeline with the same dispassionate logic a surgeon uses to remove a tumor. The perfect campsite wasn't a taunt. It was sterilization. It was the wardens tidying up the messy foreign matter they found at the site of the wound. My own trauma, the airstrike in Afghanistan, which had felt like the defining tragedy of my life, was rendered infinitesimal. The clinical detachment of the military command that had shattered me was just a flawed, pathetic imitation of this cosmic indifference. Roth and his men, with their probes and sensors, were like bacteria trying to analyze the antiseptic that was about to wipe them out. They couldn't fight this. You can't declare war on a fundamental principle of reality. The glimpse held me for an eternity or a second. When it released me, I fell to my knees on the rocky ground of the real Zion, gasping. My head throbbed with the ghost pressure of alien gravity. The silence of the canyon felt loud and full of life compared to the emptiness I had just experienced. I had stared into the void, and it had shown me my place in the universe. Not as a ranger, not as a soldier, but as a fleeting, chaotic microbe pressed against the glass of a microscope slide. I staggered back from the portal, my body a foreign country I was just learning to occupy again. The solid, gritty feel of the canyon floor under my palms was an anchor. The air, tasting of dust and sage, was a relief after the non-atmosphere of the glimpse. I was left with the knowledge, a piece of ice in my gut, that humanity's most ambitious plans were little more than the scribblings of a child on a wall that was about to be demolished. A crackle in my ear, sharp and violent, broke the quiet. "Rylance, do you copy? What is your status, over?" Roth. His voice was a thin, tinny intrusion, a message from a world that no longer seemed entirely real. My comlink, dead for hours, was working again. Proximity to the source. "Your vitals are stable," Roth's voice continued, a hint of frustration in it. "We're reading you. Report." I looked at the pack the technicians had abandoned. Strapped to its side was a polished aluminum cylinder, about a foot long, with a recessed glass lens at one end. A high-yield environmental probe. A tool of analysis and quantification. A piece of the very system that believed it could chart and subdue anything it encountered. "Rylance, your orders are to deploy the probe, approach the event boundary and launch it into the anomaly. We need to know what's on the other side." I stared at the black, silent tear in the world. Roth wanted to throw a rock into a quiet house to see if anyone was home. He didn't understand that the house itself was alive, and that it considered rocks to be a disease. The glimpse had shown me their nature. The wardens were beings of absolute, unviolated order. To them, our messy, chaotic existence was a pathogen. Forcing a complex piece of our technology, a concentration of our physics and logic, into their reality would be an intolerable act of contamination. An invasion. Their response would not be measured. It would be absolute. They would sterilize the threat, and their definition of local might just include the entire solar system. I unstrapped the probe. Roth was still talking in my ear, his voice rising in pitch, demanding compliance. He was a ghost, a representative of a system that had already failed, issuing orders based on an ignorance so profound it was suicidal. "Rylance, acknowledge the order. That is a direct—" I had to make a choice. Not as a ranger protecting a park, or an operator completing a mission. I had to act on the truth I'd been shown. The wardens couldn't comprehend irrationality. An act of selfless sacrifice, of emotional defiance, of pure, pointless chaos. That was the one weapon they had no defense against. It was an error in their cosmic equation. With a wordless roar, I swung the heavy aluminum probe like a club. I brought it down against the sharp edge of a granite boulder. The sound was obscene in the quiet canyon. A brittle crack of tortured metal and shattering glass. I smashed it again and again, the finely milled components crunching under the blows, the delicate lens system splintering. I was destroying a multi-million-dollar piece of military hardware, an act of career-ending treasonous insubordination. It was the most logical thing I had ever done. The effect was instantaneous. The black slash of the portal convulsed. The act of chaotic destruction, of entropy being deliberately and violently enacted on its threshold, was a shock to its system. It shuddered with a horrifying implosion. The air screamed as it rushed into the void. The edges of the rift tore inward, unraveling reality as they went. For a single, eternal second, the two-sun sky was visible again, vast and burning, before the world slammed shut with a sound like a mountain breaking in half. Then, silence. The shimmer in the air was gone. The unnatural cold dissipated, replaced by the honest, dry heat of the Utah sun. I stood panting over the wreckage of the probe, my knuckles bloody. My comlink was dead. High above, I heard the familiar call of a canyon wren. The sound was a benediction. I was alone. I had obeyed my own orders and, in doing so, had likely saved two worlds that would never know it. I had achieved the one thing I had been looking for since Afghanistan, a single, morally unambiguous act. It had just cost me everything else. I turned my back on the place where the portal had been and started the long walk out. The canyon was whole again, but my own internal atlas had a new, permanent feature. A place of absolute desolation, a scar so deep it would never fade. I was its only landmark. They kept me in a windowless room at Nellis, the Air Force base outside Vegas, for 2 weeks. It wasn't an interrogation, not really. It was a quarantine of the mind. Men in suits, not uniforms, would come in and ask the same questions in different ways. They showed me satellite photos of the canyon taken before and after. In the after photo, the tributary where the portal had been was just a canyon again. No energy signature, No cold spot, just rock. Colonel Roth came on the last day. He looked older, the certainty in his eyes replaced by a deep, bureaucratic weariness. He sat across from me at the metal table, a thin file between us. It was my file. The official report states that Operation Blind Sentry encountered an unstable, localized spatio-temporal event, he said, not looking at me. The event collapsed under its own mass energy deficit. The loss of the primary sensor probe is attributed to the collapse. Your actions, though, unorthodox, resulted in no loss of life among mission personnel. Staff Sergeant Riggs's report commends your leadership in the field. He paused, finally meeting my eyes. O'Connell is in a permanent care facility at Walter Reed. He doesn't speak. Davison has been medically discharged. He can't be in a room with a mirror. They tell me you're fine. I'm fine, I said. It was the simplest lie. You destroyed government property, Rylance. Extremely expensive property. The anomaly became unstable, I replied. The probe was destroyed in the event. We stared at each other for a long moment. He knew I was lying. But my lie explained the facts on the ground in a way that fit neatly into a classified report. The truth, that I had prevented an interdimensional incident by committing an act of calculated, irrational vandalism, was useless to him. My story closed the book. The truth would have forced him to open a library of horrors he couldn't comprehend. Your contract with the National Park Service has been terminated, he said, sliding a pen and a single sheet of paper across the table. You will sign this non-disclosure agreement. In return, you will receive your full pension and an honorable discharge from your obligations to us. You will not speak of Zion. You will not speak of the Garson family. You will not go back. I signed my name. I was free, but on a leash so long I could almost forget it was there. My greatest fear, loss of autonomy, had been realized not with a gun, but with a pension and a signature. I don't live in the desert anymore. I bought a small cabin on the Oregon coast, on a piece of land that backs onto a forest of Sitka spruce and cedar. The air is wet and heavy and smells of salt. It's a different kind of wilderness, a different kind of honest. The roar of the Pacific has replaced the silence of the canyons. Some nights I walk down to the beach and stare out at the water, another vast, indifferent force that cares nothing for the struggles of men. I never found the silence of conscience I was looking for. I traded it for a silence of knowledge. I am the sole curator of a memory that can't be shared, the keeper of a truth that sounds like madness. My memory of Zion is no longer a map of trails and canyons. It's just a single, indelible wound, a place I can never revisit, but can never leave. I carry the memory of what I saw through that portal, that silent, ordered world under two suns, like a permanent filter on my own reality. It is a terrible burden, and a strange, quiet gift. It burned away all my old angers, all my petty grievances against flawed human systems. You can't hold a grudge against a man when you've felt the gravitational pull of his planet. I watch the waves crash on the shore and feel the damp wind on my face. Then I look up at the sky, at the single, brilliant, uncomplicated sun hanging above the grey water. It's enough. One sun is enough.